Get ready for a story, a true crime story so twisted you won't believe it.
Yeah, it's...
We're talking twin sisters, accusations of murder, and a legal system that seems to have taken a few wrong turns.
And what's so fascinating about this case is how it shows just how powerful a single confession can be, even if it comes from someone who's not exactly reliable.
Today we're breaking down a classic 48 Hours episode 48 Classics by 2 and 2. It tells the story of Dr. Jack Wilson, a wealthy doctor from Huntsville, Alabama,
Right, Huntsville.
who was found murdered in his home.
And the prime suspects. His wife, Betty. And get this, her identical twin sister, Peggy.
And the story gets even crazier when you realize that these two sisters ended up with completely different verdicts.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
So let's start at the beginning in Huntsville, Alabama. Dr. Jack Wilson and his wife, Betty. They seem to have it all, wealth and a beautiful home.
The perfect life.
Yeah, but like we always say, appearances can be deceiving.
Oh, absolutely. The crime scene itself is brutal. Jack was found beaten, stabbed, and strangled in his own home.
In his own home.
Yeah, naturally suspicion immediately falls on Betty.
But here's where things get interesting. The Wilsons' marriage wasn't exactly traditional. Betty openly admitted to having affairs.
Oh, wow.
And she said that Jack knew about them and was surprisingly okay with it.
That definitely raises some questions about motive. Was Betty unhappy in her marriage? Did she stand to gain financially from Jack's death? Or was this like she claimed a random act of violence?
And then enters James White, the self-proclaimed hitman. His story's so full of contradictions.
Oh, yeah.
Drug addiction, a history of petty crimes, documented psychiatric problems, and a habit of, well, stretching the truth.
You start to wonder if he's telling the truth at all.
Yeah, and this is where the case really hinges. James White's confession is what the whole prosecution's case is built on. But the more you look into his background and his story, which seems to change every time he tells it.
Yeah, his credibility really starts to fall apart.
His story changes every time. Details or different dates get mixed up, and it always seems to line up perfectly with whatever the police have just discovered.
Like magic.
It makes you think, was he really the one behind this murder? Or was he just playing a part?
A part that fit the police's theory.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the deal James White got. He was facing some serious charges, potentially even the death penalty.
Wow.
But he agreed to testify against the twins.
So he got a much lighter sentence.
Yeah, and the possibility of parole. It's like he was given a get-out-of-jail-free card in exchange for pointing the finger at the twins.
That's a scary thought. The power of a plea deal.
It really shows how one unreliable confession can derail an entire investigation and potentially lead to a huge miscarriage of justice.
Absolutely.
And here's the really crazy part.
Great.
There's no physical evidence connecting White to the crime scene. The only thing they have is a bag of clothes that he claims he buried, which conveniently shows up months later.
Hold on. Months later. But didn't the police already search the area?
They did a thorough search,
Yeah.
and they found nothing.
So this bag of clothes just magically appears. That's incredibly suspicious. It seems like it just appears when the prosecution needs it most to fill in a gap in their story.
It's like something you'd see on a bad TV show.
Right. Totally unbelievable. But let's move on to Betty's trial. The media was all over this case. They portrayed Betty as this femme fatale, driven by greed and lust.
It was a complete media circus.
Yeah, and all that attention from the media probably played a big part in how people saw Betty. Maybe even the jury.
I can imagine being a juror in that trial with all those headlines and biased reporting. It would be hard to separate fact from fiction.
Absolutely. And the prosecution leaned heavily on James White's testimony, especially the part where he claimed that Betty gave him money in a library book as a down payment for the murder.
But Betty actually admitted to giving him money.
She did.
Yeah, but she said it was just an act of kindness. Her sister Peggy had asked her to help White get to an AA meeting. He was struggling with alcoholism.
So it was just a good deed.
That's what she said. But the prosecution ignored that explanation and focused on Betty's lifestyle and her affairs.
Especially the one with a man of a different race. It seems like they were trying to make her look bad.
Like she was a bad person?
Exactly. It's a classic tactic, trying to sway the jury based on someone's personal choices rather than actual evidence.
And unfortunately, it worked. Betty was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole.
Wow. A life sentence based on the word of a confessed hitman with a constantly changing story and a lot of speculation about her character.
It's hard to believe that Peggy was granted bail while Betty wasn't. Their trials were so different.
Night and day.
Yeah.
And what happened at Peggy's trial completely changed everything.
So Peggy's trial was in Montgomery, and the stakes were high. Her defense team had their work cut out for them.
Yeah, they had to prove Peggy was innocent, but they also had to take apart the whole case, the same case that sent her sister Betty to prison.
Exactly. It was a
Yeah.
huge challenge. And what's amazing is they did it. Peggy's trial became this example of how to use legal strategy to challenge everything and expose the weaknesses in the state's case.
It's pretty incredible.
The differences between the two sisters were just striking. The media made Betty out to be this scandalous figure, but Peggy seemed like the opposite, a church-going, soft-spoken wife and mother.
Yeah, a total contrast. It's hard to imagine these two being involved in the same crime.
Right, and it makes you wonder if the prosecution's portrayal of Betty was even accurate or if they were just trying to fit her into some kind of stereotype.
It's definitely something to think about. And Peggy's defense team, they used this difference to their advantage. They painted her as a victim of circumstance, someone who got caught up in a mess created by a manipulative con man and a police force that just wanted to close the case.
It's like they were so focused on getting a conviction that they didn't care about the truth.
And they didn't just play defense, they went on the attack. They challenged every single detail of the prosecution's story. They even raised doubts about basic things like the murder weapon and where the crime happened.
Yeah, that's where Dr. Chris Berry comes in. He's a forensic expert, and his testimony was a game changer. He said that the injuries on Jack's body didn't match the supposed murder weapon, that baseball bat they found at the scene.
So the prosecution's whole theory about how the murder happened was wrong.
It seems that way. Sperry suggested that the murder weapon was something completely different, like a fireplace poker. He also pointed out that there wasn't enough blood spatter at the crime scene for the kind of struggle the prosecution described.
Hold on. Are you saying that Jack might have been killed somewhere else and then his body was moved to the house?
That's exactly what Sperry was implying, and it throws a huge wrench into the prosecution's case. It makes you wonder if they were just trying to make the evidence fit their story.
Wow, it's like their whole case is falling apart.
Right. And Peggy's lawyer, Buck Watson, he was brilliant. He didn't just defend Peggy. He also defended Betty by pointing out how ridiculous it was to think that Peggy could be guilty if Betty was innocent.
Because the state was saying they worked together?
Exactly. Watson basically used the state's own argument against them. If their case against Peggy was weak, then their case against Betty had to be weak too.
That's some clever lawyering.
It was. And it worked. The jury acquitted Peggy after deliberating for just a few hours. Can you imagine being in that courtroom? One twin gets convicted, the other one goes free.
It's a crazy turn of events. It just shows you that a good defense can make all the difference. It also shows you that a case built on unreliable testimony and circumstantial evidence can fall apart pretty easily.
And then the story gets even wilder. James White, the guy whose testimony sent Betty to prison, he recanted his whole story.
He admitted he lied.
Yep, he said that the police pressured him and he was scared of getting the electric chair. So he made up a story to save himself.
This is insane. So if White was lying, what does that mean for Betty? Was she wrongfully convicted?
It's a huge question. And just when you think the story can't get any crazier, it does. James White then sends a letter saying that most of his recantation was also a lie.
Wait, so he lied about lying. I can't even follow this anymore.
I know, right? It's like he's playing with everyone's heads. How can anyone believe anything he says?
It's impossible to know what the truth is. It makes you wonder if he even knows what's real anymore.
So even with White recanting his testimony, it's still an uphill battle for Betty to get a new trial.
It's crazy how hard it is to overturn a verdict, even when new evidence comes up or a witness is discredited. It's like the system is more concerned with being final than being right.
And her appeals were denied right. So what options does she have left?
Well, her appeals were denied at first, but there's a glimmer of hope. One of the appeals court judges actually disagreed with the majority decision.
So one judge thought something wasn't right.
Exactly. This judge said that White's testimony was clearly unreliable and that the state hadn't handled the case properly.
It's good to know that at least one judge saw the problems with the case.
Yeah, it's important. And it could help Betty get a new trial. This dissenting opinion shows how important it is for judges to keep an eye on things and make sure the system is actually working the way it should.
It's like a reminder that even in a system that can seem unfair, there are people who are willing to stand up and say, wait a minute, this isn't right.
Exactly. And there's another possibility for Betty: DNA testing. They didn't have that technology back when the trials happened, but now it could uncover new evidence that could prove she's innocent.
So there's still hope.
Yes, science could be the key to solving this. But for now, it's just a possibility while Betty keeps fighting for her freedom.
And she has her twin sister Peggy by her side. Peggy visits her in prison every other weekend.
Wow, it's such a powerful image. These two sisters connected by their DNA and this horrible experience, but living completely different lives. It really makes you think about the human cost of this whole situation, the unanswered questions, and how everyone involved has been affected.
And here's another thing that's really stuck with me. Some of the jurors who voted to convict Betty, they still have doubts about her guilt.
They do, even after sending her to prison for life.
I know. It's hard to believe. They say they still have questions that were never answered. This case really shows you the pressure that jurors face in these high-profile trials and how hard it is to make a decision that could change someone's life forever, especially when they don't have all the information or the information they do have is contradictory.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And it's scary to think that even in a system that's supposed to be about justice, there's always a chance for mistakes, for human error, and for decisions that can have consequences that last a lifetime.
It's scary to think about how much weight a confession carries, even when it comes from someone like James White. It makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where people are in prison based on shaky evidence or confessions that were forced out of them.
It's a chilling thought, this whole case. It really highlights how one story, even if it's flawed or manipulated, can completely change the direction of the case and have these huge consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget about how societal biases might have influenced the jury's decision. Betty's lifestyle, her choices, they were put on trial right alongside the murder accusation.
It's troubling to think that they might have used her personal life against her. It makes you question the fairness of the justice system. If someone's personal choices can be used against them in court, what does that say about our commitment to a fair trial?
It's a disturbing thought, and it should make us all think about the possibility of bias creeping into our legal system. We need to be really careful about protecting against prejudice and making sure everyone is treated fairly under the law, no matter their background or lifestyle.
I agree.
This whole experience has really made me think about how easily we can be swayed by a good story, even if it's not based on solid evidence.
It's a good reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, question everything, and demand more from our justice system. We can't just accept things at face value. We have to dig deeper, look at the evidence closely, and always be open to the possibility that the truth is more complicated than it seems.
It's unsettling to realize that even in a system that's designed to deliver justice, there's always the potential for mistakes, for human error, and for those mistakes to have a lasting impact on people's lives.
Yeah, this case leaves you feeling uneasy. Can we ever really know what happened that night? Is it possible for the system to fix its mistakes? Or will Betty be stuck in prison because of a story that she says is a lie? It's tough to think about. And then there's the whole thing about luck and circumstance. What if Peggy hadn't been granted bail? What if her lawyer hadn't been so good? Would she be in prison with her sister right now?
It's a sobering thought. It reminds you that justice isn't always fair. It can be affected by things we can't control, by how good our lawyers are, by the biases of the people in charge, and even by random chance.
This is a story that stays with you. This deep dive has taken us to some pretty dark places. But it's also shown us how important it is to think critically, to question what we believe, and to demand more from our justice system.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more involved, to be aware of the problems in our systems, and to fight for a world that's more just and fair. We can't just sit back and assume that justice will happen. We have to be part of the process, hold the people in power accountable, and fight for those who have been wronged.
I hope this deep dive has left you, our listeners, with a better understanding of this case and a desire to keep searching for the truth and to never take justice for granted. Thanks for joining us on this journey.